The first gaming experience. That's a thing that varies a lot depending on when and where an individual grew up. You see, over the years I've heard and read many stories of people getting to know the mostly fantastic world of gaming for the first time. I think it's safe to say that a lot of people keep the first few games they've enjoyed near and dear to their hearts. You know what I'm talking about. I remember playing ABC as a kid, being mind blown by XYZ. But that's not really how things went for me. Back in the day, I played a bunch of Flash games to get my fix, and most of them were pretty bad. At that time, Flash games were kind of like mobile games nowadays. The popularization of software like Adobe Flash and websites like Miniclip and Newgrounds made game development much more accessible than ever before, giving many their first shot at creating games. And that was very good. And very bad. But let's focus on the good bits here. When I was a kid, I remember a certain website called Nitrome being one of my go-to places to play games. At the time, I just felt like their games featured interesting mechanics that weren't found in those generic janky 2D platformers that inundated the web. For a few years, I occasionally visited their website in the hope of seeing a new game on the front page until I got my DS Lite and my interest in their games and Flash games in general crashed and life went on. But more recently, I started reminiscing the past and started asking myself this question. Do these games actually stand the test of time, or was I just a very impressionable kid? So, out of both nostalgia and curiosity, I've decided to take a look at the legacy Nitrome left in the Flash game world. I want to start this retrospective of sorts by taking a brief look at Nitrome's history, because as much as I enjoyed their games back in the day, I never took the time to actually learn about the developers themselves and how this whole thing came to be. Our story starts with Matt Annal, a British graphic designer who was making his living creating Flash websites and Advergames for various brands, wanting to have a bigger internet presence. For those who don't know, Advergames, as you may have guessed, are games made specifically to advertise a brand or product. They can also show up in the form of product placement inside of a video game. In 2004, Annal eventually grew tired of the creative stranglehold his clients had on him, so he decided to partner up with another graphic designer named Heather Stancliffe, and together they founded their own game company to break free from the chains of publishers. According to an older version of his website, Nitrome's creation went something like this. You know, all this web stuff's okay, but wouldn't it be great if we could just make whatever we wanted? Heather raised her eyebrows. I don't think anyone's gonna give us free reign to do just whatever we want. Matt replied, well, why don't we make a mobile phone game or something? Heather sighed. Yeah, and I suppose I would just have to pick up a bunch of new programming skills overnight. Matt said, yeah. And at that point, Nitrome was born. There is still an important unanswered question though. What the hell is a Nitrome? In an interview with Flash game review site GisGames.com, Matt stated that the name Nitrome was picked more for strategic reasons than anything else. By choosing a non-dictionary word as the name of their website, Matt and Heather ensured that SEO would push it to the top of the search results page whenever someone would look them up on a search engine. On top of that, they wouldn't have to worry about the Nitrome.com domain already being taken. From that point on, they would publish a new game to their website almost every month without missing a beat. And while there would be the occasional sequel here and there, most of these games feature brand new mechanics and assets. They would also dabble their feet into mobile game development from time to time before getting a little more serious in the early 2010s when smartphones started to gain popularity. As of the publication of this video, Nitrome has published a grand total of 142 games on their website, and over the course of this 4-part series, I am going to play every single one of them, and spend a minute or two voicing my opinions for each of them. Think of these as mini reviews. Now, quick warning. I won't play them all to completion, as it would frankly make this retrospective even harder to make than it already is, though I'll make sure to play roughly half of every game I cover just to make sure I get out of the tutorial levels and see what regular gameplay looks like. And for the connoisseurs out there, I know I skipped over a ton of details when it comes to Nitrome's history, but I truly wanted to focus on what was relevant to this video, the games that can only be played online, the Flash games. But rest assured I will cover some of those other details during part 4's conclusion. With this out of the way, for play is Nitrome's very first game, and it's not playable anymore. I could only find 2 horrendously low quality pieces of footage that I had to speed up by 100% and enlarge by 200% just to make them watchable, and it's basically nothing more than a cell phone version of Connect 4. Not this kind of cell phone, this kind of cell phone. There are no twists, no gimmicks, and absolutely nothing special with this game. Nitrome deemed it to be so simple it wasn't even worth putting on their website, as it was just meant to be a test for Flash Lite, which according to Adobe's website is a powerful runtime engine for mobile and consumer electronics devices that benefits both device manufacturers and content developers. Or in not corporate language, it's a mobile version of Flash. I've tried looking on mobile Java game archives around the internet in the hope of playing it on an emulator, but I couldn't find a copy of this game anywhere, so I can't see anything about how good it actually is. I'm afraid this one has already been lost to time. Hot Air is a game where you must guide a hot air balloon to the end of each level while avoiding walls and obstacles. You can also go the extra mile and collect stars scattered throughout the levels to unlock bonus levels. Your cursor turns into a propeller that you use to blow air towards the balloon. So the control method here is weird, and I feel like that's what sets this game apart from what was seen online at the time. I feel like having dynamic responsive physics makes the game look a touch more modern. The levels look distinct enough from each other and bring something new to the table, some kind of new obstacle to avoid each time. They all require you to make careful, minute movements to navigate around them, and the controls do not allow you to make these minute movements. The balloon is incredibly sensitive to every spin, and it's a little difficult to go in a straight line because of that. You often end up moving at an angle when you don't want to and end up having to move your cursor back and forth to go in a straight line. Sometimes your balloon ends up sort of snapping into spikes even when you really should have been able to avoid them. And then there's level 7. Less than halfway through the game, there's a ridiculous difficulty spike that nearly had me give up and just stop. You must make your way through spinning passageways at just the right angle and just the right timing with almost no wiggle room to move around. And every time you lose, you're kicked back to the main menu and have to wait for this damn circle thing to spin into place. I blasted through the first 6 levels in literally 4 minutes, but it took me 40 just to finish this one. It is unbelievably frustrating. Anyway, presentation-wise, this game features the bright, cartoony pixel art Nitrome is known for, and its visuals aged very well. Overall, when you consider what it had to compete with at the time, it's really no surprise this one stood out among other Flash games. It comes up with a fun central mechanic and takes said mechanic to the stratosphere, with a level of polish not seen very often in 2005 Flash games. But there's a lot of little janky things, and a pretty massive one, that make this game quite hard to come back to. Sandman is a game where you must carry a group of sleepwalkers to safety by creating sand piles. Remember what I just said about Hot Air having this bright, cartoony pixel art that aged well? It's been replaced by this slightly more realistic style, full of vector graphics, gradients, and skeuomorphic elements that make this game look ridiculously dated in comparison. I don't have enough patience to enjoy this kind of game. Both the sleepwalkers themselves and the rate at which the sand is poured are painfully slow, and I just found myself waiting for things to progress after making each of my decisions. For example, here, I know for a fact I must make a small pyramid to get my sleepwalkers to the top, but then I have to wait for the sand to slowly form that pyramid, so I'm just sitting here holding the mouse button for an eternity. And you know what? The main mechanic doesn't have that much to it anyway, you just pile up sand. Some extra mechanics like enemies and invisible platforms are added later on, but even those don't really help make the levels more interesting. Every time I look at the level, I think, guess I have to place sand here, here, and here, and I hold the left mouse button for a few minutes. I appreciate Nitrome going out of their way to make something different instead of moving right onto Hot Air 2 or something, but this just isn't it. We have sound and VFX quality settings, so there's that. Chick Flick is a game about two squirrels trying to get chicks into a nest using a trampoline. If they touch the ground, you lose a life. Lose all your lives, and it's game over. It's a pretty simple concept, but it gets the job done, I guess. The game also throws some wrenches in your plans by introducing different kinds of chicks and gimmicks, like this ancient Egypt level with lower roofs or this frustrating motorized nest that keeps on moving around. Things get really tedious after a while, to be perfectly honest. When I played the game, I would often undershoot or overshoot, especially with these tiny chicks that go way faster than the other types. Every 20-ish seconds, a new chick drops from the sky, but the game doesn't tell you where they're coming from, or even when it's about to happen, so you end up having to sacrifice one of your chicks because, oops, they're at opposite ends of the stage and you have no way to prepare for that. There's also a co-op mode you can use to have fun with friends and family, or if you're like me and you don't know anyone willing to play 14-year-old Flash games with you, you can control both players and make the game ridiculously easy. Yet again, we don't have pixel art, but it's not as bad as Sandman because instead of having 3D-ish vector graphics, we have simple cartoony vector graphics that do not look nearly as dated. Roly Poly is a game where you must rotate circular levels to lead the porcupine to the finish line. Hell, even the menu is based around that idea. The levels are designed well enough and are a test of timing, precision, speed, or any combination of the three. The physics are really not the greatest. It's a little difficult to put into words, but there's just this certain clunkiness with the way your character moves in relation to the rest of the level. It's almost as if it accelerated and decelerated too suddenly in a way that does not feel very natural. It didn't hurt the gameplay much, but it's worth pointing out. What does hurt the gameplay is the control method. It doesn't take a genius to figure out that this game would be much better suited for mobile. But this is 2006 we're talking about. The iPhone was still a year away, so mouse is the best thing we have. It works, but making sudden movements is pretty hard, and most of my deaths can be attributed to that. Nevertheless, I still enjoyed this one. Feed Me is a game where you use a carnivore's plant's ridiculously elastic neck to traverse levels. You move your plant by biting floors, walls, platforms, or ceilings. You can also eat insects to extend your plant's maximum length, making it easier to move around. Just make sure you stay away from hostile insects and hazards, or you'll take damage. Though if that does happen, you get to hear this goofy sound. I like this game's idea, but the execution, it's not the greatest. For starters, the physics are extremely wonky. The plant moves in a very jarring, erratic way. Every time it bites something, it swings around like you would expect it to, but instead of gracefully swinging back and forth, it snaps back and forth in a very disorienting way. The collision detection is also a little wonky, and I wound up getting stuck in platforms or going through walls more times than I can count. I also found that some places felt nearly impossible to reach without taking damage because by the time the plant had reached the ceiling, it was already in a pit of thorns, and with how small your invincibility window is, it doesn't take long before you take too many hits and have to restart the level. I know it sounds like I hate this game, but I don't. The idea is there, and I enjoyed trying to go through levels as fast as I could whenever the game did work properly. Unfortunately, I can't really recommend this one as I spent more time fighting against the physics than, actually playing the game. Gift Wrapped is basically that one minigame in Super Mario 64 DS where you had to find the character shown on the top screen among a bunch of other faces with a little added challenge. Every gift is wrapped. So you have to deduce which one is where by looking at their shapes, and some of them are tilted, I guess. And that's it. They even called it a time waster in the game's description. And boy, have some people wasted a lot of time on this game. Scribble is basically Sandman 2, except you draw platforms and walls with ink instead of pouring sand, and you must lead as many blots, that's what your little guys are called, to the exit as you can, provided you respect the minimum goal. On the flip side, your enemies can also walk on your drawings, so you have to be mindful of where you place your lines. Since you no longer have to go through this every time you want to make a platform, things aren't nearly as tedious as with Sandman, and Scribble's levels are a fair bit more exciting than the ones seen in the former game. Having finer control over your platforms means you can multitask a little more. So for example, you could be solving a puzzle in one part of the level, and then realize your blots are in danger and quickly draw a line to save them. But this finer control comes at one hell of a technological cost. The lines are insanely glitchy, and your blots will sometimes fall through a tiny hole that is way smaller than their body, or completely ignore your lines. The tiniest imperfection is enough to make a difference, and I would have liked the game to be a little more lenient. Then again, this is Flash, in 2006, so I'll stop complaining. Okay, pause here. I was editing this segment and I noticed that there are some really important things that I completely forgot to talk about. So consider this some kind of addendum. First, the art style. It looks really good, and I think it fits the main mechanic really well. This whole hand-drawn aesthetic, I love it. Second, speaking of main mechanic, your ink, you can't just draw forever. You might have noticed, or not, that there's an ink meter at the top of the screen, that is. And when you run out of ink, you can't draw anymore, and you have to wait for your previous lines to disappear. But I feel like you don't have enough ink a lot of the time, and it can make some of the levels, this one especially, really difficult to complete. Maybe the right strategy was sailing right over my head. There's a chance that it's what happened, but even in the other levels, I would find myself getting a little annoyed, constantly having to wait for my ink to recharge. That's it. That's all I have to say. Let's move on to the next game. Frostbite is a game where you must get your character to the top of a mountain using his grappling hook to avoid obstacles and kill enemies. You can also collect various frozen desserts scattered across each level to increase your score, or collect the 5 letters spelling the word bonus to, well, get a score bonus at the end. This is Nitrome's first platformer, and it shows. The controls are very clunky, I'm not going to lie, and the grappling hook can't shoot in all directions, only 180 degrees above your character. You could argue that aiming downwards is pointless in a game where you have to go upwards, but I feel like grappling a platform once to get to it, and another time to kill a monster or just reach the ground faster, would make the entire game smoother. But at this point, I'm just nitpicking. Frostbite is good, and it gets my approval. Also, I can't get enough of this sound effect. I love it so much. Tanked Up is a racing game where you control a tank and must shoot your opponents to slow them down and reach first place. The cooldown after each of your shots forces you to actually aim properly instead of being a trigger-happy maniac, and of course your opponents can shoot you too. Run out of energy and you instantly lose the race, F-Zero style. So basically you drive, you shoot, and that's the end. A lot of times you just end up getting into a deadlock with the other tanks, and if you somehow manage to survive that hell and come out on top, it doesn't take long before the CPUs rubber band their way back to you. I kind of feel like an idiot for saying this, but this isometric view is throwing me way off. The controls remain the same regardless of the tank's orientation, so when it's going upwards everything is fine, but when you're going downwards, the left key turns the tank to its left, not yours, and vice versa. I'm not saying that flipping the controls every time the tank goes downwards would be better, in fact it would be much worse, but I still had some trouble getting used to the other control method. All in all, I'm not too fond of this one. It's just frustrating to get shot by the other tanks and be stopped dead in your tracks every few seconds. Oh, and did I mention some stages have hazards that can also stop you if you're not careful? I feel like Tank Top could almost be classified more as a stopping game than a racing game. It's just not a fun game to play. Magic Touch is a game where evil knights are trying to land into your castle by slowly descending from the sky using balloons. You must draw the shapes on those balloons to pop them, preventing the knights from fulfilling their plan. The more knights you defeat, the higher your score is, and if one knight, just one of them, lands into your castle, then it's game over. And you know what? I think it would play much better on mobile, and so does Nitrome, because they eventually did release a mobile version of the game. Your mouse is just not precise enough to draw a lot of these shapes, which isn't that bad since the game is very lenient in regard to what it accepts as the right shape, though things can get rather hectic once the knights start to descend faster and are tied to more balloons. Also, am I the only one who had a lot of trouble with this godforsaken shape as a kid? I seriously could not get past that weird 8 on its purple balloon before, and I may or may not still have some trouble with it. Oops. Skywire is a game where you must carry the passengers of an aerial lift to the end of each level while avoiding deadly toy animals that seem to have gone haywire. Get hit by one of them and you lose a passenger. Lose all 3 of your passengers and the game is over. I won't beat around the bush. This is my favorite game so far. Once again, this is a very simple game, but that most definitely works in its favor. You simply use the arrow keys to move the lift left and right. Your lift can also be affected by the game's physics, so if you're at a part where the line is heavily slanted towards the right, it will be harder to go left and easier to go right. It may not seem like much, but nothing really beats the satisfaction of figuring out the right way to avoid a specific toy animal and finishing levels without suffering a single casualty. Actually, I had to play most of this game again because my original footage got corrupted and I still had a blast playing it. If I haven't made that obvious enough by now, I wholeheartedly recommend this game and it is every bit as good as I remember. Okay. That's a pretty nice reference. Space Hopper is a game where you jump from planet to planet to collect stars. Collect every star in a level to proceed to the next one. I can see a lot of inspiration from a certain other platformer that came out around that time. Unfortunately, these kinds of games where you collect items to move on to the next level have never really appealed to me. It just takes forever to collect every star while making sure you do not get hurt, and I got bored of this one pretty quickly. Sure, there are different planet types. Some of them have lower gravity, some of them are icy and therefore really slippery. There are also comets that you have to avoid. None of these things really helped in my book. The planet physics are better than I expected for a Flash game this old, but they most definitely do not have interesting levels to go with them. Dangle is a game where you must lead a spider hanging on its thread to the end of each level. To do so, you must dangle left and right while avoiding enemies and obstacles. And those dangling physics feel much more natural than those in Feed Me, which is basically a must since at this point the entire game is based on swinging. Other than that, I don't have a whole lot to say about this game. As you make your way through it, you see new types of enemies like this blue monster that sticks to your thread until you shake it off, or those fans that screw with your momentum. There is, however, one level I've enjoyed more than the others because of a small twist it introduces. Level 8 starts you close to the bottom of the level, but in a position that makes it impossible to reach the goal immediately, forcing you to go back to the top and make your way down from a different place. It's a small thing, but I thought it was worth mentioning. So yeah, TLDW. Dangle is fine, and it has good swinging. Good grief. Hot Air 2 is a game that works basically the exact same as Hot Air 1, no surprises there, but it does what any good sequel should do. It takes what made the first entry good and builds up on that, and it also irons out the mistakes made by the original in order to fully flesh out the core idea, and this is what makes this one special in my eyes. The game starts out with the most cliché story you could possibly have for a video game. Blue Guy's lover gets kidnapped by an evil guy named Baron von Blimp. So Blue Guy must embark on a dangerous journey to save her. What a hook! Seriously though, this is not The Witcher 3 or something. No one cares about the story in this type of game, so let's cut to the chase and talk about gameplay. The first thing you're presented with is this Mario-esque world map, which is a big departure from the usual level selection screen seen in Nitrome games. I was already looking forward to the branching paths and the secret exits these maps allow, and then, as I progressed through the game, I noticed something. The map is a complete and utter lie. See these signs? They indicate the number of stars you need to collect in order to go through. At first I thought this was the total number of stars you collected in levels, so 1 star in a level was 1 star on the world map. That is not how it works. Instead, collecting every star in a level awards you a star in the world map. Since the first sign you encounter requires you to have 18 stars and there's 20 regular non-bonus levels in the game, you can't start playing the bonus levels until you're very close to the end of the game. So this map is basically a very elaborate version of the level selection screen seen in the first game. Though it serves basically no mechanical purpose, it still adds some visual flair, and that's always a good thing if it doesn't come at the cost of gameplay. Sorry about the map rant. I had to get it out of my system. Anyway, the levels. They now have names, and every single one of them is a pun or joke. Make of that what you will. The levels are great for the most part. Just like the first game, there's a plethora of hazards and enemies to avoid, and each of them feel distinct from each other. My favorite one being this level where you must avoid landing on the goal platform in order to collect every star. What kind of level turns the goal into a hazard? Every time you complete a level, you're rewarded with a new skin, and frankly, most of them look terrible. Back when the game first came out, users could also use a companion game called Hot Air Balloon Maker to make custom balloon designs that could be used in Hot Air 2 or published in a gallery publicly showcasing other players' creations. But this is the internet we're talking about. Unsurprisingly, many use the tool to create inappropriate designs, and the large amount of submissions for the gallery reportedly crippled the website, on top of requiring a, quote, member of staff to permanently stop making games just to deal with them all. This all led to the maker getting shut down on March 5th, 2009. Bosses have also been added to the game. The first one is the Octoboss. It's about what I pictured when I tried to imagine a Hot Air boss. Avoid the monster that only moves around and doesn't attack you, and land on these yellow platforms to shoot bullets. Do these actions 3 times and you're done. It's nothing special. There are some moments where I got sandwiched between spikes and the Octoboss, forcing me to restart the level, which is not that bad because you're no longer kicked back to the main menu every time you lose. But if you think this boss was underwhelming, wait until you see what the final boss is like. Yeah, I really don't know what happened here. I'll take a guess and say they really needed to get the game out and did not have enough time to playtest this one thoroughly. And that's it. Blue Guy defeats the Baron, saves Kayal, and they decide to get busy. As I said, there's a couple of bonus levels as well as an extra boss locked behind star requirements, but collecting every star in 18 different levels kind of goes beyond the scope of this retrospective. But none of that matters. This is the best Nitrome game so far, which is why I ended up breaking my own rule and playing it the whole way through, because I just couldn't turn off the recording. And I can honestly go out and recommend it to anyone looking for a good game you can complete in one sitting. Please play this game. It deserves your attention. Square Mail is a game where you have to eat blocks and spit them back out at enemies to stun them and eat them. Eat every enemy in a level to move on to the next one. I fail to see how this game is supposed to be interesting or fun. Sure, there are some hazards and different enemy types to shake things up a bit, but they were never challenging or interesting enough to pull me in. Any second now. Take your time. After Hot Air 2, this feels like the poor soul who has to do their oral presentation after the previous person absolutely killed it. This one does not do it for me. I played 25 levels of this game and it was an absolute bore fest the entire way through. I had to listen to a podcast in the background just to get through this one without losing my sanity. Not recommended if I haven't made that clear enough. Toxic is a game where you use a variety of bombs to make your way through what seems like a nuclear plant full of acid. To the risk of sounding like a broken record, there just isn't a whole lot to keep me hooked. Other than the bomb mechanic, which gets moderately interesting when you discover new types of bombs, it's just a basic platformer where you avoid obstacles and the controls are not good. Your jumps feel devoid of any weight and your character's walking animation doesn't match their speed, which makes the movement even more jarring. On top of that, I don't know if this is caused by the game being too old to be played on a modern browser or something, but the collision has some serious problems. You can go straight through solid walls like they're nothing. I kept on expecting things to get better, but after playing half of the game, I'm afraid they didn't. Also, Toxic's music is really good. I don't know why I forgot to mention it in my review, but I just remembered while I was editing. That's it for the addendum. It's not going to be as long as the other one. Yeah. Yin Yang is a puzzle platformer where you control two characters located in a black and white world and use negative spaces to get to the end of each level. The Yin character can only travel in black spaces and vice versa. I can seriously never get enough of seeing what is an object for one character become part of the environment for the other one. The controls are not the best, again, though I can let it slide for this specific game since it's really more about puzzle solving than platforming. Every level is named after two closely associated things, which I find pretty cute. Bread and butter, fish and chips, sugar and spice. Overall, Yin Yang is good fun. The puzzles aren't the most complicated or the most elaborate, not in the few levels I've played anyway. The game isn't anything mind-blowing, but not everything has to be. Nanobots is a shoot 'em up where you must destroy waves of colored viruses using matching weapons, and I hate it. My biggest complaint being the sheer length of the levels. Even the very first one lasts for what feels like an eternity, and all you do is move around and wait for the enemies to show up so you can destroy them. Your default weapon is a classic pellet projectile, but there's also yellow mines and a green spiky ball that spins around you. None of those weapons are particularly fun or interesting to use, with the worst offender being the green one, especially when trying to defeat those super viruses. Despite not liking this game at first and really wanting to cut my play session short after two very long levels, I kept on going. And I still didn't like the game. Your weapons eventually receive an upgrade that make the game a little less tedious to play, but you still just move around, shoot enemies, and avoid enemy fire. This is undoubtedly one of the worst, if not the worst, Nitrome game I've played so far. It's sad to see, but when you make a new game almost every month, you're bound to make some mistakes. So let's move on and hope things change for the better. And change for the better they did. Off the Rails is a game where you lead two cactuses to the end of each level by repeatedly pressing the left and right arrow keys to power their handcar, after they die on the title screen, that is. You can also jump with the spacebar, and should you time your jumps right, you can even perform a as you can imagine, your fingers are going to be quite tired after a while, and I like that. It emulates the feeling of pumping again and again quite well. Yeah, I'll have to press that pause button again because I'm about to spoil a pretty important moment in Metal Gear Solid for the PlayStation 1, and I know it came out a long time ago, but I'd rather err on the side of caution if someone watching this hasn't played it. And as sad as it makes me, chances are people watching this haven't played Metal Gear Solid. So yeah, I'm going to put a timestamp in the video right now, and you can just skip to that if you plan on playing the game in the near future. You should, it's very good. I can't help but appreciate mechanics that make the player experience the same emotions or pain their in-game character would.
Press the circle button repeatedly to regain your strength. When you've had enough, press the select button to submit. When your life reaches 0, the game is over. There are no continues, my friend.
The levels revolve around going at the right speed and timing your jumps to avoid obstacles and cross bottomless pits. Some of them have you go at vertiginous speeds, while others force you to slow down and take things one at a time. In general, I don't think this game is amazing by any means, but I certainly had fun playing it, even though it makes me regret the day I decided to get a mechanical keyboard. Headcase is a game where you control a superhero who can jump from wall to wall and from ceiling to ceiling, as long as he's not standing on this gooey, sticky surface. You can also walk on walls and ceilings if jumping is not your thing. And guess what? The controls are actually pretty decent this time, and the game itself is just okay. Sorry if I sound like a broken record by now, but I find this game to be a bit too basic for my liking. Level 1 is nice and easy to get you used to the basics. Level 2 throws a couple of enemies and obstacles you must avoid, and level 4 has pipes that can take you to other parts of the level. And that's it. I kept on going until I reached level 13, and things never got more interesting than that. I'd like to stress that I only played half of the game, so things may get better later on, but the levels I did play just felt very samey and ended up kind of blending together in my mind. So while this game is far from a dumpster fire, it's another one to add to my list of just okay games. Pest Control is Mario Paint's fly swatting minigame extended into a whole game. You have a fly swatter, and you have to kill insects within the allotted time limit to complete a level. Complete 8 levels, which can be played in whichever order you prefer, to unlock a boss stage and defeat said boss to clear a world and move on to the next one. Each insect has a different quirk to it, and you must analyze their pattern to gain the upper hand. Some of them can hurt you or move at very high speeds, for example. Slamming them is very satisfying, and even though this game's concept is very simple, it works beautifully, and I adore this game. Twang is a game where you fling a ball from rubber band to rubber band while making sure to avoid enemies and obstacles. I'm going to be honest, this review was really tough to write because I just couldn't think of much to say about this game when I had originally played it. This has happened to me a couple of times before, and when that happens, I simply play the game again to help me gather my thoughts. After all, just saying, I don't have anything to say is a pretty pathetic excuse for a review. But this is the first time going through the game again didn't help at all. I still don't have much to say about this game. So you know what? Screw it. I don't have much to say about this game. The challenge lies in figuring out how far back you're supposed to pull each rubber band in order to reach the next one. And even though there's a few different types of rubber bands, grouped bands, disappearing bands, super stretchy bands, I feel like this mechanic is just meh. The only thing I can say in favor of this game is that the sound effect that plays when you collect the stars is in tune with the background music. I would like to make it clear that I do not think Twang is a bad game. It is just overwhelmingly just okay. And despite being only at game number 23, I've already played too many just okay games to give this one a pass. Thin Ice is a game where you figure skate your way to victory by cutting the ice under monsters, causing them to fall in a frozen lake. It's also a Frostbite spin-off? The theme matches, so I can run with that. The game is a bit on the basic side of things, even by Nitrome standards, and it gets repetitive pretty quickly. Defeat every enemy on screen to proceed to the next level. Collect frozen desserts to increase your score. Collect the letters spelling the word bonus to get a score bonus at the end. Though I must admit all this simplicity is sort of amended by the maddeningly smooth controls. I feel like I could twirl around this lake forever. Plus you can do this? How can you dislike this spinning? Snowdrift is a platformer where you control a Yeti who can slide on ice to gain speed and take out small penguins that fall like bowling pins. And it's another average platformer with a somewhat interesting mechanic that is never used in a truly compelling way. In the 10 levels I've played, the formula was usually an alternance between fast sliding sections and slower platforming sections, not unlike Sonic games of old. Like a lot of platformers I've covered so far, the controls are too floaty for my liking, and those platforming sections I mentioned earlier don't go beyond jumping from platform to platform. It's really basic. Again. But you can slide on ice this time. It's just okay. Jack Frost is a game in which the titular character turns anything he touches into ice, freeze the entire level, and you're done. Nitrome was really into winter-themed games back in 2007, weren't they? You know, I just criticized Snowdrift for being a rather basic platformer with sliding, but I take it back. There is nothing, and I mean nothing, of interest in this game. You just walk around and cover the level in ice. Oh, and ladders are kind of broken, by the way. You absolutely have to start climbing them from the top or the bottom, otherwise nothing happens when you press up or down in front of one. For some reason, enemies just become invincible when they climb a ladder. You can temporarily freeze enemies by jumping on them and use the resulting ice blocks as platforms, but if a frozen enemy is in front of a ladder, you can't climb it, you can't freeze it. Despite what I just said, the one level I truly enjoyed was ironically one that had a ton of ladders. Before you scream at me for being so contradictory, let me explain myself. Level 15 is composed of several floors, let's say, and each of those floors is too low to jump over the enemies that populate them. Because these purple guys can climb ladders, you're forced to plan ahead if you want to avoid getting sandwiched and inevitably taking damage. This may sound like an annoying level to play, but I honestly found it pretty refreshing after spending 14 levels running around and jumping on enemies in the same way. There's also a 2-player mode. By now you know what I'm going to say. I can't test it, but I took a very quick look anyway, and it's the exact same game and the exact same levels, but now 2 frosty guys are competing to freeze 100% of the level and have more coverage than the other player once the level is complete. So it's kinda sorta Splatoon before Splatoon? Aquanaut is a game where you must guide a yellow submarine to the end of each level while defeating enemies and avoiding obstacles. You can also collect gems to increase your score. This kind of feels like hot air, but underwater. Of course there are some differences, it's not the exact same game. Levels are lengthier, you can take more than one hit before dying, you have weapons, and you shoot out of the water to gain a jump of sorts. Despite that, the core gameplay feels very played, especially by Nitrome standards. You slowly and carefully maneuver your way around obstacles with a somewhat unorthodox control method, and yeah, I find this one a little underwhelming, if you couldn't already guess. Go Ufo is a racing game where you boost around tracks as fast as you can. There's a catch though. There is no move forward key. You can only turn left and right or boost. The longer you charge your boost, the further you go. It's the classic racing game conundrum. If you go too fast, you'll constantly fall off the track, but if you go too slow, it'll obviously take you a lot longer to complete the level. So it's about going at just the right speed and just the right angle. Though with the whopping 3 levels to play, it'll probably be a matter of minutes until you've seen everything this game has to offer. Unless you played the multiplayer mode, that is, because this is the first Nitrome game that can simultaneously be played by up to 4 different players. And as usual, I can't test it, but after taking a quick look, it's the same game and the same 3 tracks. But players can bump into each other. This really seems like the kind of mechanic that makes for the kind of chaotic multiplayer that is very fun, but that would drive me nuts very quickly. Also, yes, I noticed that some of the track names are references. Dirk Valentine and the Fortress of Steam is a game where you play as Britain's greatest explorer, spy, and master of esoteric fighting, Dirk Valentine, and try to defeat evil war machines using a chain cannon that can bounce off walls and create platforms. Dirk is supported over the radio by this Einstein-looking man called Monty, who informs him on upcoming enemies and hazards. And for the first time, the story goes beyond a couple of sentences at the beginning explaining the setting. Monty isn't just a more natural way of giving tutorials, he also makes comments on Dirk's actions. There's one part where I encountered an armored enemy and he compared the optimal strategy to defeat it to cricket. The levels aren't just a random collection of stages either. They're all set on different parts of the Baron's ship. There is even a late-ish title card. I know this is all very basic stuff, and you can tell the devs just wanted to make something goofy. But this is such a welcome change compared to the usual NES like, here's a couple of levels, now complete them, and you just don't get anything else. Speaking of levels, let's move over to gameplay. This game is more than just okay. It's pretty solid, actually. For starters, the controls are way better than the other platformers I've tried so far. They're not slippery as hell, and your character isn't floating around like they're in space. Trying to hit as many enemies as possible with your chain cannon is always good fun, and the levels get gradually more complex by adding different types of enemies and obstacles that give you less time to make your jumps and require you to aim more precisely. This isn't like Square Meal or Headcase where you're halfway through the game and things are not that much more complex than level 1. So yeah, this one's a winner. I'm not in complete love with it, but it is such a breath of fresh air after so many just okay platformers that don't push their mechanic far enough. Magna Boy is a puzzle game where you move by magnetically pulling yourself towards platforms, your goal being to get to the end of each level while making as few moves as possible. Like any good puzzle game, it gets more complicated as you progress and you start seeing new mechanics like movable platforms, keys, and arrows that can change the direction of your magnetic pull. Some levels aren't even puzzles at all and simply require you to run away from enemies. Even though I'm not very skilled at puzzle games, the 25 levels I've played were a bit on the easy side. I didn't necessarily blast through them, but I would often take a few seconds to look at the layout and think something along the lines of, okay, they clearly want me to go around the level and reach the exit. However, considering the sheer number of mechanics introduced in those 25 levels and the fact that the game has a total of 50 levels, I am convinced that things get nightmarishly difficult in the final levels, especially if they start mixing and matching that stuff. Oh, and one last thing I would like to touch on is the music. You may have noticed that I don't talk about music very often, and that's because aside from a few exceptions, I think it usually ranges from not so great to average. But the music here sounds oddly gloomy and, dare I say, borderline unsettling. I don't know how to describe it, but I feel like if I had played this game as a kid, late at night, with the lights turned off, I would have been terrified. Cheese Dreams is a platformer where you are a moon and you bounce around various levels while avoiding enemies and obstacles. The game opens with a very small moon getting eaten by a spaceship piloted by alien mice who mistake said moon for a very large piece of cheese, and it must now escape the ship. Your moon is like one of those bouncy rubber balls you inevitably ended breaking something with when you were a kid and constantly bounces with a very stretchy, satisfying animation. Throughout the game, you play with the various physics properties that come with such an object. Levels are also larger than those found in your average Nitrome platformer, which makes sense given you need enough room to bounce around. Since the moon is always bouncing, you have to make sure you don't hit obstacles on your way down, but also on your way up. My only complaint with this game, and it's a minor one, is a camera. Some levels feature cannons that allow you to reach new areas or quickly get past an obstacle, but sometimes the camera wouldn't let me see the entire area surrounding the cannon, which forced me to make a shot in the dark. At least you're not totally screwed because the little stars you collect show you where you need to shoot, but it would obviously have been better to just be able to see the entire area. It's a band-aid fix. It works, but it's not ideal. Other than that, Cheese Dreams is good fun. Snot Put is a game where you try to fling snot as far as possible. It's very weird and, oddly enough, addicting for about 10 minutes. It has a very mobile-y format in the sense that you're just trying to get the highest score you can. You can make things easier by increasing the page's zoom and never ever ever letting your cursor go out of frame, lest your scores be incredibly low. I don't know if I should be impressed by these physics or disgusted by the very concept of this game. Knuckleheads is a game where you control two steel balls and luchador masks that are chained together. One always follows the other and you can control your speed by making the chain longer or shorter. Those colors aren't just here for show either. Enemies can only be defeated by a ball of the same color. Likewise, some obstacles won't deal any damage if the colors match. Emphasis on some. And at the end of every level, you have to whack this bell as strongly as you can, and I must say it is pretty satisfying to hit the top. In this one, you spend most of your time guesstimating how long your chain needs to be in order to get to where you want. It's a little basic. Avoid spike, avoid enemy. There are some sticky surfaces here and there that let you travel upside down and on walls. Despite that, I still had fun playing this one, except for this tower level where if you fall off, it's all the way back to the beginning. That sucks. Yeah, it really sucks. Skywire 2 is, well, a sequel to Skywire, and it's more Skywire. This one adds a two-player mode that, as usual, I can't really test because I don't have anyone to test it with, but I gave it a spin anyway, and it features the same levels seen in the single-player mode. You're just put head-to-head with the other player in a race, and at the end of every level, the winner gets a point. But the main dish here is the single-player mode, so let's talk about that. The gameplay is mostly the same as the first game, with a couple of added mechanics to keep things nice and fresh. New features include a new cast of toy animals trying to kill your passengers, underwater sections that you must get out of before your passengers run out of oxygen, breakable sections, and boss stages. This turtle boss is not particularly interesting or exciting to face. It goes up and down and that's it. After that, you move on to World 2. Yeah, you heard me right. There is more than one world. We can finally get a break from this yellow background we've been seeing for 500,000 years. I don't know if it's just me, but World 2 really seems to love its breakable sections. They're all over the place. World 2's boss blows the first one out of the water. I am very sorry for this pun. I really dig this idea of these ostriches essentially being born just to kill you. Their mother slowly swooping downwards is also a nice way to give you just enough pressure to create some urgency. You must be reasonably fast and precise to clear this stage, and I liked it quite a bit. This game didn't blow me away like Hot Air 2 if you excuse the other pun. I am so sorry. But this game still gets a shining recommendation from me. Small Fry is a game where you must lead a group of small creatures to the end of each level. It's like Sandman and Scribble. But this is the first game of that type that I actually really enjoyed. Not that I didn't like Scribble or something, but I like this one better. You'll see. To move a creature around, you drag it to where you want it to be. I might look crazy getting excited for such a basic feature, but we went from tracing paths indirectly to tracing paths directly to just placing the creatures, and it speeds things up significantly. It is such a welcome change from previous games. Though there are places you can't drag your creatures to, they exist only to create puzzles or teach you a new mechanic, so I don't mind it at all. Speaking of mechanics, you might have noticed that there's more than one type of creature this time around, and they all have unique quirks you must use to get through each stage. The skeleton can't die as it's, already dead, and it can walk underwater. The sporty can jump when it reaches a ledge, climb walls, and swim across ponds. The brain turns around when it reaches water or a ledge and can interact with these flower-shaped switches. And finally, the warrior can attack monsters and smash blocks. Putting the focus on the creatures themselves and how you can use their abilities to get through levels is to me much more enticing than putting it on where they're going, because I'm no longer just waiting for them to cross the platform I created 10,000 years ago. And while the levels I've played are a bit on the simpler side, I stopped at level 10 for the purposes of this video, so I wouldn't be surprised if they get more challenging and interesting with time. Either way, this one gets my recommendation and represents the kind of evolution that I wanted to see in Nitrome's game design when I first started making this video. Good job. And this is where the first part of this retrospective ends. Next time, we'll be looking at the next 36 Nitrome games and see what surprises they hold. I am, of course, well aware this video was pretty long, and if you've watched it in its entirety, I would sincerely like to thank you for doing so.